Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But you know, KSJE is now listener-supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast.
Good morning. This is Traci Hales with Right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico, 103.3 FM in Durango, Colorado. Today I'm talking with Jennifer Bohnhoff about her book, Where Duty Calls, Rebels Along the Rio Grande, Book 1. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Traci. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you today.
Well, thank you for letting me read Where Duty Calls. And I want to let you know that I was really enjoying the book, even though it's written for a younger age. It's very good for adults.
That is great to know. Actually, I have more adults that buy it than children who buy it, and I hear that a lot. So thank you for collaborating on that.
Absolutely. I learned a lot, too, about what New Mexico was doing in the Civil War.
It's something that people just don't know. I'm amazed at how many people have no clue that anything happened here during the Civil War.
You don't even think about it, because it's not like...
It happened all east of the Mississippi as far as most people are concerned.
Right. But not so.
Not so at all.
Well, before we proceed, why don't you give our listeners a little bit of a synopsis of Where Duty Calls?
Okay. Let me start by just telling you, I used to be a New Mexico history teacher, or middle was, and the textbook was dull. And it zipped through the Civil War happened there, and I think it misrepresented what happened there. So one of the reasons I wrote this was to give people a better sense of what happened. The story takes place in 1861 and 1862, and every other chapter, it goes back and forth between two main characters. One is Jemmy Martin. He's a Texas farm boy from the San Antonio area, and his brother sells the family mules to the Confederate Army to help pull their supplies in a wagon, and he feels compelled to go along, and he's not in those mules and get those mules home again, or because he believes in the Confederate cause at all. The other half of the chapters are about Raul Atencio, who's a young Hispanic kid from Socorro. His uncle is a merchant who sells grains and other supplies to Fort Craig. He's not interested in a war either, but he ends up at Fort Craig when the Confederates get there, and the two boys end up meeting. It happens right outside of Fort Craig in down near Socorro, southern middle of New Mexico.
These boys are in such different socioeconomic and geographic and everything. They're so different, yet they really aren't that different.
I think, by and large, boys aren't.
Right.
They all want to grow up and become men and become good men. And you're right. Both of these boys are doing their best to be good people and to be successful at what they like.
They both have good hearts.
That's nice to know. Thank you.
They do. Jemmy is such a pacifist that he comes into this violent situation, and it's so upsetting for him.
He's a gentle soul.
Yes.
His father was involved in a confrontation that happened between Texas and New Mexico in the 1840s. It's called the Santa Fe Expedition. And his father is a very wounded man. Jemmy has grown grown up seeing that and is terrified of it, really.
And Raul, on the other side of the chapters, has grown up in a completely different atmosphere.
Yes. He's Hispanic. His family has been here for 250 years. And he's one of those scrappy individuals who the early settlers here, they couldn't trust the Spanish government to help them out. Spain was and didn't do much. Spain lost control and Mexico took over, and they were so busy fighting among themselves in Mexico that they didn't help New Mexicans. Mm-hmm. New Mexicans, by and large, grew up not trusting anybody from the outside, wanting to control their own destinies. And 15 years before the Civil War started, New Mexico had become a territory of the U.S., and to many Hispanic people here, it was just one more group of outsiders who didn't know what they were doing and should just leave New Mexico to New Mexicans.
Right.
That's how Raul felt. That's how his father felt. His uncle, the merchant, however, felt anybody can come in as long as I can make a buck off them.
Right, right. It's so true. I found it interesting, the treatment that Raul's family had toward the Navajo people that worked for them.
I think a lot of people don't understand what was going on here in New Mexico. For a lot of people, the Civil War is about slavery.
Right.
And freeing the slaves. And when they think of slaves, they think of African Americans, of blacks. We had very few slaves that hit that category here in New Mexico. There was a handful. Mm-hmm. And when the Confederate Army came in, many of their officers brought black slaves with them to work as their servants. But here in New Mexico, we had very different kinds of slavery. Ever since the Hispanics got here, there had been slavery of the Indians, particularly the Navajos and the Apaches, some Comanches, some Utes, most of the traveling nomadic tribes. Beginning with the Spanish and continuing on, people would raid Indian communities, steal the children, bring them back, and use them as household servants and as shepherds. Mm. That kind of slavery was very, very common, and the Civil War didn't do anything to really stop that. It wasn't until several years after the Civil War that the Indians who had been slaves, were finally freed. The other kind of slavery we had here in New Mexico was peonage. Mm. There were a lot of the poor, lower-class Hispanics who didn't own land. They worked on the land of richer people, and they often did it they traded their ability to work on the land for service to those people.
Mm, right.
Basically, they were serfs or slaves.
Right.
And they weren't freed until 1867, too.
That's fascinating. This is something that I was not aware of. But you have an affinity for the knowledge in this area and this time.
That's what I was hoping to get across.
Yes.
Each gives some important things without either preaching at them or making them memorize big, long lines of dates and names.
Yes.
Because that's what a lot of history is, and frankly, that's dull.
It is. But this brings it alive, and it teaches local things. And I really appreciated that.
Well, thank you. That's what I was hoping to do.
You got it. Do you want to read something from Where Duty Calls for us?
Sure, I would love to.
Good.
I got a couple of sticky notes stuck here in the book, and the first one is really talking about what we just talked about with Raul.
Okay.
So this will give listeners a chance to kind of hear some of the history that we've been talking about.
Great.
Let's is from the second chapter, and it is, the first chapter rolls in. If there was one thing Raoul's father had taught him, it was to never trust an outsider. His ancestors, a hardy band of Spanish settlers, had come to this harsh and barren land 250 years ago. They had dragged their carts, goaded their oxen, and herded their sheep and cattle up the Camino Real, the dirt track that led from Mexico City to Santa Fe. They had sweated and labored and built a life for themselves without the help of any government. Not the Spanish government, who taxed and regulated them from their fancy palaces back in Europe. Not the Mexican government, who'd been too busy fighting among its factions to send troops north to fight their enemies, the Navajo and Comanche. So, while New Mexico had been a part of the Spanish Empire and then the new country of Mexico, it had been up to New Mexicans, the descendants of those early settlers, to govern themselves. 20 years ago, in 1846, the Americans had ridden in and proclaimed that New Mexico was now theirs to rule. But proclamations proved nothing. In order to truly rule a land, its rulers needed the loyalty of the people. They needed the people's trust. Couldn't they see that the New Mexicans trusted these invaders even less than they trusted the Spanish or Mexican governments, who'd at least spoken the same language and belonged to the same religion? It would take more than proclamations to turn New Mexicans into Americans. New Mexicans didn't need any of these outsiders to rule them. They could take care of themselves. They had done exactly that for the last 250 years.
That's right. At least they thought so.
Okay, so that's Raoul. Raoul learns in the course of the book that not all Americans are what he thinks they are. He begins to realize when he's stuck there in Fort Craig that many Americans have the same hopes and dreams that he does,
right,
and are human beings just like he is. He's lucky in that he ends up under the watchful eye of Kit Carson,
right,
who was one of the leaders of the New Mexico Volunteers. Kit is an interesting person in that he's a hero to a lot of people and he's a villain to others.
That's true.
So I do kind of expect some people to not be happy with Kit looking like a decent human being.
And he does there, and I think you're right that nobody's completely black or white, that he is... he had his humane characteristics, for sure. And I like that you showed that, and his care for the young man.
And that we know to be true about Kit Carson. He had children, and he loved to be down on the floor playing with them.
Oh.
That was his favorite place.
So, now, did you do extra research to put this book together, or were you using research that you had been doing for your teaching?
More than I had to do for my teaching. I read dozens of books and primary documents, and some of the most interesting research were diaries from the people. Although Jemmy and Raoul are not real people, a lot of the people in the background are.
Okay.
And Frederick Wade, for instance, he's one of the soldiers in the Confederate Army, ended up being a newspaper man in later life and wrote lots of articles about his experiences.
Oh.
And they were fun to read.
I like his voice. He's quite, he knows the big words, whether other people around him don't.
Yeah, he was a school teacher before he joined the Confederate Army.
Right.
Yeah, he was fun. It was grand fun to work with him.
Yes.
And the other soldiers, because some of them knew a lot and some of them didn't.
Right.
So they got to interact like that.
Yeah, that brought those characteristics out. You showed those really well. Made them very real people. I think it's interesting that it didn't end where we thought it might, but you do have 2 more in this series coming, right?
That's right. this tells the story of the first major battle, the Battle of Valverde. The second book is the story of the Battle of Glorieta, which is often called the Gettysburg of the West. It wasn't anywhere near as big or as bloody as Gettysburg, but it was the high water mark. Both Gettysburg and Glorieta were as far north as the Confederate armies managed to make it in their two different campaigns. At Gettysburg, Lee gets defeated and turns and goes south. At Glorieta, it's Sibley who gets defeated and decides that he cannot attain his goal, and he turns around and goes back. There's one more battle after Glorieta, and that's the Battle of Peralta, and that's what Book 3 will be about.
Okay, so we're looking for the worst enemy and then this famished land coming up.
Yes.
Well, that's exciting, but you have a lot of other books on your website.
I've been writing for quite a long time.
I can tell.
Love writing. I love the research. So they're not all about the same period of history or the same place, because I go down a lot of different rabbit holes.
I love it. Now, do you write just for the middle school, or are some of these others, the Anderson Chronicles, for example, are these for other audiences?
The Anderson Chronicles, there's 3, and I've got a 4th one. Now a matter of getting the illustrator to do the cover. They're short, contemporary, silly books, and they're really for 4th and 5th, 6th graders, maybe some 7th graders. The main character in there is Heck Anderson, who's a 7th grade middle schooler. Most of the time you write your readers just to let your readers know where they're going in the future.
Right.
And then I have 2 books that are more adult. The Last Song of the Swan is a rather complex book. I don't think anybody could read it before they were a senior in high school. It's the retelling of the Beowulf story.
Oh.
But it's a double retelling. One is a contemporary girl who's got to write a research paper on it, and she starts digging into it. And the other story is the Beowulf story set far, far back into prehistory.
Oh, wow.
And it's not an easy read, but I think it's an important read. It's talking about how we determine who is human and who is not, and how we take our enemies and we make them unhuman so that we can justify hating them so much.
And what's the title of that one again?
The Last Song of the Swan.
Sounds wonderful.
And then I have one other adult book. It's called A Blaze of Poppies, and it's set in southern New Mexico on a ranch right outside of Columbus, New Mexico. And it's the story of a young female rancher who has to contend first with the Pancho Villa raid and then World War I as she attempts to keep her ranch in the family and deal with all the chaos of war and what that does to the economy, what that does to people. She ends up being a nurse who goes to Europe and has a love interest who was a National Guardsman who was in the Pancho Villa expedition and then went with Pershing to Europe.
That sounds ambitious also. So you write full-time now?
I do. Well, as full-time as anybody can. I got a dog to walk. I do a lot of writing. And
Yes.
what I love more than anything else is getting into the classroom to talk about these things.
Oh, I bet.
I've got a great PowerPoint on the Civil War in New Mexico. I've got another one on the role of the National Guard in the Pancho Villa raid and how that prepared America for World War I. And I just love getting in and talking with kids and adults.
So you're available for discussions like that for presentations. Great. And we can
I
find...
can do them. One of the only great things about this whole COVID business is it's gotten more people online.
Right.
So I can do people who are far away without charging them for having to travel.
Isn't that
That's
great?
Nice.
Your website is Jennifer Bohnhoff, BOHNHOFF.com, and there's information about all of that on the website. So that's exciting. You've really worked hard to prepare that so that you can give those presentations.
It's fun stuff. When I was teaching, in addition to doing New Mexico history, I spent many years teaching English as a second language.
Oh.
And those kids desperately needed the images, the pictures, so that they could tie it to the words. So I love having lots and lots of pictures and maps just so that people can see and visualize what they're reading.
Speaking of illustrations, Ian Barstow was illustrator for Where Duty Calls. And I like that there are pictures within each chapter, or the beginning of each chapter.
He did a gorgeous job, didn't he?
He really did. He really did.
Yeah. I have never met him. My publisher, the Artemisia Press, got us together, and he would write and ask, what's going on in this chapter, what do I need to have, and he was very responsive, and he did some gorgeous illustrations.
He really did.
And then in addition to that, in the very front of the book, there are a couple of maps, so you can see who as he came, and then a second one that shows what happened at the Battle of Valverde. Those two maps were created by my son, Matt Bohnhoff.
Yeah, those are really...
He's an artist, and he has illustrated and done book covers for mostly role-playing game books.
Oh, wow. Okay. Aptitude toward drawing these maps comes from. They're very well done.
He loves maps.
I thought it was funny that, I think it was Raul was given a map, and he said, sure, I can read this, but he really couldn't.
Yeah. He never had one before.
Right.
Maps were rather unusual things. They're difficult to print, so there weren't that many of them.
See, I had never thought about that until I read that, and I went, yeah, those aren't that common.
If you have never been more than 20 miles from your home, why would you need a map?
Exactly. I like the way in the book, there's a character arc between both of these kids, and they grow up. Yeah.
I've got to thank my publisher, Jeff Habiger. He did a lot to help these kids grow up gracefully and nobly. And he gave me a lot of guidance, and that was helpful.
Well, that's great. Now, will we see these two boys again in the other books?
You will see Jemmy throughout.
Oh, good.
Because the arc of the story is the Confederate Army coming into New Mexico and then escaping from New Mexico. Jemmy is there throughout. Raul is in book number 1, and then Jemmy moves out of Raul's sphere of influence. So in book number 2, Jemmy has a new person that he has to encounter, and that person, Cian Lachlan, is an Irish orphan who had come to Colorado with the play well for him, and like many of the Colorado volunteers, Jemmy decided to join the Army when the Civil War broke out, feed him and give him clothes. And so he's part of the group of Coloradans that come down and fight at the Battle of Glorieta.
Wow.
Then, after the defeat, in Book 3, as Jemmy turns around and goes back toward Texas with the Army, all 3 of the characters are going to end up meeting up together.
Now, I hope that eventually we'll find out the rest of Jimmy's story and his family's story. I don't want to give a lot away, but that's always the mystery in this one.
And I hope it ends in a way that is satisfying but true and honest.
Right,
also.
Right. What a balance there. So when can we expect The Worst Enemy?
To be honest, I've signed the contract, but I don't have a pub date. I'm hoping it will be next spring.
Okay, so it's forthcoming.
And I'm hoping that this famished land will follow a year later.
Great.
I do hope people who read this get a better understanding of what people were like.
Yes.
And get a better understanding that people are people. And
right.
They have been since people have been around.
Right.
We've got a lot of things that are in common, and we need to learn to stop looking at people in black and white and respect all those colors that are in between.
That's right.
And how different we are and how similar we are.
Absolutely. And I definitely see this being used in the classroom and in your presentations. I think that's great. That's
my hope. There is a teacher's guide that I've written. It hasn't been published yet.
Okay.
But it's big, and it's got a lot of good discussion questions.
That's great. I think that'll be really helpful. Really enjoy talking to you. I look forward to the next books, and I'm definitely going to check out The Last Song of the Swan, because it sounds fascinating also.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this time.
You bet. Thank you, Jennifer. And that was Jennifer Bohnhoff talking about her book, Where Duty Calls, Rebels Among the Rio Grande, Book 1, a middle grade novel about the Civil War in New Mexico. This is Traci Hales with Right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico, and 103.3 in Durango, Colorado.
Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.